Welcome back to part two of Soils and Plant Nutrition. In this section, we're going to talk a little bit about plant nutrients and fertilizers. Plants require certain nutrients for growth and reproduction. The exact number they need depends on what list you look at. This list has 13 different essential plant nutrients. Plants also need carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but they get those from carbon dioxide, water, and from free hydrogen ions in the soil. So in this list here, we have nutrients that plants generally need in larger amounts, which are called macronutrients, and then other nutrients that plants need in very, very small amounts called micronutrients. So the three main macronutrients are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Plants also need calcium, magnesium, and sulfur in kind of an in-between amount. It's kind of in between a macronutrient and a micronutrient. And then plants also require iron, manganese, zinc, copper, boron, molybdenum, and chlorine, but in very, very tiny amounts. So macronutrients are the nutrients that plants need in a relatively large amount. Micronutrients are needed in much smaller amounts, but all are important for normal healthy plant growth and reproduction. So if a plant doesn't have enough of any one of these nutrients, it will suffer and will start to have symptoms. Plants are normally going to suffer from a shortage of a macronutrient like nitrogen, phosphorus, or potassium, but some plants, even if if palm trees are deprived of boron, the soil has absolutely no boron in it. Palm trees only need boron in very tiny amounts, but they will suffer dramatically if they have absolutely no boron available to them in the soil. Most of these plant nutrient ions have an electrical charge associated with them. If one of them has a negative charge, it's called an anion. If it has a positive charge, that's a cation. This becomes important because soil particles have a very slight negative charge. So whether it's a particle of clay or sand or organic matter, it's going to have a negative charge. So what happens is the positively charged ions are attracted to the soil particles and held on the soil particles until the plant root comes along and removes it and takes it up into the plant. The negatively charged ions are not held very well in the soil, so they're much more prone to leaching or being washed out. Most of the soils in Hernando County have plenty of phosphate in them because we mine phosphate here in the county, so our soils are naturally very high in it. Not all soils. Every once in a while you get a soil test back and somebody will not have enough phosphate in their soil, but generally there's plenty of it here in Hernando County. So even though phosphate has a negative charge, it doesn't readily leach from our soil. One problem is, though, if you overuse phosphorus, if you fertilize with it when it's not needed, it can run off very easily. And if very tiny amounts of phosphate get in different waterways, it'll cause algae blooms. Phosphate's kind of a funny ion also because it's very sensitive to pH changes. If the pH is too low, phosphate is going to bind with iron and now it's not available for the plant even though there's plenty in the soil. If the pH is too high, phosphate will bind with aluminum and once again it's not available for the plant. So your soil has to have a mid-range, slightly acidic pH for phosphate to be readily available to plants. That's why it's very important that you get a soil test done every couple years to determine if phosphorus is needed and also to check your pH to make sure that the pH of your soil hasn't changed dramatically. So to review, healthy plants do the best at nutrient uptake. Uptake is related to a lot of different environmental factors, especially temperature. Generally, the warmer the temperatures, the better the nutrient uptake. Sometimes warm season plants being grown over the winter or very early spring when the soil is cold makes some of the different nutrients not quite as available. That can happen with phosphorus also. And then cultural practices like watering are linked to uptake. Obviously, a plant that's deficient in water is not going to be able to take up nutrients nearly as well as a plant that's well watered. So if somebody is having a problem with the plant, don't think that just throwing fertilizer at it is going to solve your problem. You really need to do a soil test first to find out where you stand with nutrients in the soil, and take a hard look before recommending just more fertilizer, because that might not be the best answer for the situation. So why do we fertilize plants? Well, some reasons why you do not want to fertilize it is just because it's June 1st, or it's the first of the month and that's when you always fertilize. We need to have a good reason to fertilize plants before you put the fertilizer down. One of those might be to achieve a desirable plant response. That could mean either faster growth, more attractive flowers, more attractive foliage. You may want to fertilize your lawn to make your grass grow a little bit faster, to make it a little bit greener. Also to prevent or correct nutrient deficiencies. With certain plants, this is very important. If you're growing palm trees or citrus, you want to use an appropriate fertilizer in advance to try to prevent nutrient deficiencies. So you're going to go by either visual deficiencies, by looking at the leaves. The leaves are yellow, they're brown on the tips, they're curling, whatever might indicate a micronutrient deficiency. Or if you send off for a soil test and it shows that your soil is naturally short on a nutrient, you may want to add that in advance before putting in your garden, putting in your vegetable garden. Or commercial growers will send leaves off for tissue testing. When they get the results back, the results may show that the plant in question has a deficiency in zinc or some other micronutrient, and that's a good reason to add it also. But you really never want to fertilize unless you have a reason to fertilize. Now, if your plant is deficient in a certain nutrient, it's going to show it. You're going to have visual symptoms on the leaves, the stems, the fruit. This diagram here is a little complicated, but on the left-hand side are all the different nutrients that are technically mobile within a plant. So a plant, as it grows, will take up the nutrients, put the nutrients in the leaves. Let's say your plant all of a sudden becomes short on nitrogen. As it grows taller and bigger and puts on new leaves, it can take the nitrogen from the old leaves and put it into the new leaves. So if your plant has a nitrogen deficiency, you're going to see the symptoms in the old leaves. The plant's always going to swipe the nitrogen from the old leaf and put it in the new leaf. Other nutrients, once it's put into a leaf, the plant cannot take it out. So as the plant starts to grow, if it has a deficiency in, let's say, copper or zinc, the copper or zinc is going to go into the leaves. It gets stuck in the leaves. So as the plant grows and puts on new leaves, that's going to have a shortage of the micronutrient. So the first step is to look at the plant and say, okay, is the visual problem with the new leaves or with the old leaves? That helps to narrow it down. And then you see this diagram here has some of the different visual symptoms that a shortage in different nutrients can cause. Nitrogen will generally mean your plant is very light green or a little bit yellow. If it has a phosphorus deficiency, the plant could be a little bit red or purple color. So you can look over this diagram here. Like I said, it's a little complicated. We'll go ahead and try to get this to you on paper, printed out, so that you can hold on to it for a reference. Diagnosing different nutrient deficiencies just by visual symptoms is a little difficult, but we'll see later on in upcoming modules, especially when we cover citrus, palms, certain other plants, they're prone to different nutrient deficiencies, so the common ones can be a lot easier to diagnose. So if you're wondering what kind of fertilizer you should apply to any given plant, you're going to want to use the recommendations for plants from the University of Florida. If you get a soil test done, you will be given this information. We're going to go into soil testing when we meet in person, and we're going to go through a couple examples of soil tests. But you can find, for any given plant, the recommended fertilizer and fertilizer types for that plant through University of Florida EDIS documents. The University of Florida does provide soil testing, and at our office we provide that service also. We will explain hands-on show you the forms that need to be filled out, exactly how to take a soil sample to be sent off for testing. Basically, the test will tell you what the levels of phosphorus, potassium, magnesium, and calcium are in the soil, so that you'll be able to see right up front, either I have plenty of phosphorus in my soil, therefore whatever fertilizer I choose should ideally have very, very low or no phosphorus, or maybe you do need phosphorus in your soil, and that's going to help determine what specific fertilizer you get. So some of the different terms that you might see on a bag of fertilizer, um, a fertilizer blend has several different nutrient sources mixed together to create a fertilizer for a specific purpose. An example of a fertilizer blend would be citrus fertilizer, palm fertilizer. They make rose fertilizer. This is something specific that's mixed because they know exactly what kind of nutrients that you would need in those fertilizers, and those nutrients are present in that fertilizer. The fertilizer grade is the percentage by weight of nitrogen, which is N, phosphorus, which is P, and potassium, which is K. So on the front of a bag of lawn fertilizer, it might say 10-5-5. That means in that bag of fertilizer is 10% nitrogen, 5% phosphorus, and 5% potassium. And then a complete fertilizer contains nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. You can get fertilizers such as urea, ammonium nitrate, and the only nutrient they contain is nitrogen. You can get forms of phosphorus and potassium that only contain phosphorus or only contain potassium. But if a fertilizer has all three, it's considered a complete fertilizer. An inorganic or synthetic fertilizer comes from materials that are either mined or synthesized from non-living materials. Different inorganic and synthetic forms of nitrogen are made from the Haber-Bosch process, which is where nitrogen that's in the air is converted to an actual physical form. It's first converted to ammonia and then ammonium. It gets a little complicated. Organic fertilizers are derived from the remains or the byproduct of an organism. That's there's a lot of different organic fertilizers. Some of them are byproducts from different processes. You can get things that are made from feather meal, which actually comes from animal feathers. Blood meal, which is processed from animal blood, very high in nitrogen. Bone meal, which comes from animal bones, byproduct of slaughterhouses. Water-soluble or quick-release fertilizers dissolve rapidly in water, and they're immediately available for uptake by the plant's roots. An example of this would be like a Miracle-Gro fertilizer, where you take a spoonful of it, you put it in water, you stir it, and it dissolves completely. When you water your plant with that, the different fertilizer ions are in a form that the plant can take up right away immediately. At the other end of the spectrum are slow or controlled release fertilizers. These are fertilizers that are not going to be available right away to the plant, but the nice thing is that if you use these fertilizers, they break down slowly and make the nutrients available bit by bit over a period of time for the plants, so they're going to fertilize the plants for a longer period of time. A problem with water-soluble or quick-release fertilizers is it dissolves right away, it's immediately available for the plants to take up, but if the plants don't take it up within a period of a few days to a week or so, either the fertilizer is going to be moved through the soil into the groundwater, or it's going to wash away. It's going to become unavailable. So a nice thing about slow-release fertilizers is they fertilize for a long time. So how do these slow-release fertilizers work? There's a lot of different types on the market now. You have polymer-coated fertilizers, which are basically the fertilizer ions inside of a small case of different types of plastic made from different materials. The original one was sulfur-coated urea. Urea is a form of nitrogen fertilizer, and they take it, if you picture an M&M, the urea would be the chocolate center, and the sulfur coating would be the hard candy coating on the outside of the M&M. So if you fertilize, let's say, a lawn with that, it takes time for the water to dissolve the sulfur coating and let the nutrient ions out, or temperature plays a very big role in it. The warmer it is, the faster the coating breaks down. Colder it is, the slower it breaks down. But what happens is over time, that coating breaks down. The fertilizer ions that are inside are able to leak out, fertilizes the plant, and then you end up with the little, sometimes empty container left over. The most important part of a bag of fertilizer is the fertilizer label. You can forget the pictures and the promises and everything else on the front of the bag. You need to flip the bag over and read the label, because that tells you all the important information. One thing it tells you is the fertilizer ratio, which is a relationship among the grade. So a fertilizer that's, let's say, for example, a 10-5-5 has a ratio of 2-1-1. So 2 parts nitrogen to 1 part phosphorus and 1 part potassium. For certain plants, there are recommendations for what ratio of the fertilizer you use. The higher the actual 3 numbers, the stronger the fertilizer is, the more concentrated it is. The smaller the numbers, the less concentrated. But the important part is getting the ratio correct. But the label will also tell you exactly what that fertilizer was made from. And from carefully reading over the fertilizer label, you will get an idea of if the fertilizer you're buying is fast release, slow release, or part of each different one. A lot of fertilizers now have some slow release nitrogen and some fast release nitrogen. That way, when you put them down, they'll fertilize. Some of the fertilizer is available right away for your plants to take up, and then part of it is in a slow release form to be able to fertilize your plant over a longer period of time. So every fertilizer label by law has to have the different ingredients that the nutrients the fertilizer was made from. In this example here, we have ammonium sulfate. That's a form of nitrogen. Potassium phosphate, obviously that contains potassium and phosphorus. Potassium chloride, that contains potassium and chlorine. Urea and urea phosphate are forms of nitrogen, and on and on. So if you're looking for a fertilizer that has a number of micronutrients in it, these will all be listed on the label also. The percentages are listed, and then whether it's water soluble, remember water soluble means fast release, or if it's in a non-water soluble, which would mean slow release form. And here we have some more examples of the different ingredients that this fertilizer is composed of. A little bit of trivia when it comes to micronutrients on fertilizers. Iron is obviously an essential nutrient. It's a micronutrient. Plants need it in very small amounts, and iron can come in a lot of different forms. One form that is very, very plant friendly, the plant is going to take up very readily, is chelated iron, and other nutrients come in chelated forms also, but they tend to be very expensive. So, as is the case in many things, you kind of get what you pay for. So really cheap fertilizers, let's say you have iron oxide, which occasionally you'll see in fertilizers. Iron oxide is rust, and it's not readily available to plants. So cheap fertilizers tend to have cheap ingredients in them. More expensive fertilizers are going to have better ingredients like chelated micronutrients and such. So some general rules of fertilizing we'd like you to keep in mind when fertilizing for yourself or giving recommendations to others. Like I said earlier, only apply fertilizer when it's actually needed. Apply appropriate amounts for specific plants. You need to know exactly how much you need to apply to a lawn. We will go through fertilizer calculations, a little bit of math involved in that, but it's very important that you put down the correct amount of fertilizer. If you put down too much, number one, you're wasting your money. Number two, it's much more prone to runoff and ending up in a waterway, or it's going to leach through the sand because there was too much for the plant to take up and end up in a waterway. You want to evenly broadcast the fertilizer around the plants or in the lawns. Don't pile fertilizer up. You need to spread it very evenly for it to be taken up by the roots. Apply appropriate irrigation as directed by the label. For any fertilizer, if you read the label thoroughly, it's going to tell you after applying this fertilizer how much to irrigate. You want to apply that much because these things need to be dissolved and worked into the soil, but you don't want to apply too much water or too little. And of course, don't apply fertilizers when heavy rain is predicted because that's just going to wash your fertilizer right off down the driveway, down the gutter. And then keep fertilizer off of hard surfaces. Fertilizer, if it lands on a concrete surface, some of the micronutrients, iron, and some of the other nutrients in it will stain your concrete. So if you get a little bit of fertilizer on your concrete driveway or sidewalk, you want to either blow that off or sweep it up and either put it back in the bag if you spilled some, or get it up into your lawn or on your plants where it's going to actually do some good. The International Plant Nutrition Institute has something that they call the 4Rs, which is something else very important to keep in mind when fertilizing. You want to use the right source, which is the correct fertilizer. You don't want to use too much nitrogen. You obviously don't, if your soil test comes back and you have plenty of phosphorus, ideally you want to try to find a fertilizer that has no phosphorus or at least very, very low phosphorus. You want to use the right rate. You don't want to put down too much at one time. You don't want to put down too little at one time either, because then you're not going to get the right response that you want. You want to put down the fertilizer at the right time. You only want to, for most plants, this is going to be spring through fall when they're actively growing. During the winter, your lawn is dormant, your citrus trees are dormant, many other things are not growing very quickly, so applying fertilizer at that time of year, it's going to be wasted because the plants are not going to actively take that fertilizer up. And to make it even worse, if you apply fertilizer during the winter, what's going to happen to the fertilizer? It's probably going to go someplace where we don't want it to. So you need to fertilize plants at the right time, and then you also need to fertilize them in the right place. That's getting the fertilizer spread over the appropriate area, keeping in mind exactly where the roots are. For trees, this is going to extend at least to the drip line of the tree, probably further. Palm trees have surprisingly large, fine roots that go over a fairly large area. So a palm tree, if you're fertilizing one, you don't want to pile the fertilizer right up against the trunk. You need to spread it evenly over a wide area to get to the roots. So keep the 4Rs in mind when either fertilizing for yourself or making recommendations. So those are the basics when it comes to soil and plant nutrients. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. You can call me, email me, contact me through Canvas website, go on the chat and put your question out there, because if you're curious about something, chances are a lot of other people are curious about it too. So please don't be afraid to ask, and we thank you very much.